1, 2.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to Recipes for Change. This is the fourth and final event in this series, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome workers and parents from the Portman Centre. We have Joe White, we have Becky Stringer, we have Fatima Haru and Samar Farish, and they've been working with artist Adelita Husni Bey over the last couple of years to develop this beautiful book, Who Cares? This illustrated book, which we have copies of up at the front here. I'm also excited that we have Jana Graham, who's an educator and researcher, and did a lot of the groundwork for this programme in the first place. She also produced a text for the book and is going to moderate a conversation in just a few moments. The food here today is from Layla, who runs Layla's Creole Cuisine on Church Street. She runs a stall there. It's just around the corner from the Portman Early Childhood Centre, and we've had the pleasure of eating her delicious food over very many years, so it's great that she was able to provide us with such delicious food today. I think everything is vegetarian. If you have any allergies, please just speak to a member of staff. My name is Alex. I'm education curator here at the Serpentine, and our focus in our programme is developing long-term collaborations that bring people together from age 0 to 90 with artists to develop projects that address urgent social issues. And one of these programs is Changing Play. It began back in 2014, and it's been developed very much in partnership with the Portman from there on in. We've had 7 artist commissions over that time, way back in 2016, I think, Adelita and I started speaking and over phone calls and emails and lots of visits to the Portman Centre, this amazing project developed, and it's so beautiful to have this, the book that was generated from the project here today. We have a small number of copies that have arrived, and with many more to follow. So if you would like to buy a book, please register your details on there, and we'll get in touch and let you know how to buy one. I'm not going to talk very much more. I'm going to hand over to Adelita because she can talk you through the project in more detail and share with you a little bit more about the process of how it came about. Okay.
Hi, thanks for coming out for lunch. And I want to extend my thanks, my deepest thanks to Alex, who really stuck by me throughout this process in very personal ways, and really gave me unflinching support for doing this over such a long period of time. So I thank you. I depended on you, and you were absolutely there for me. And thanks to Serpentine for sponsoring and supporting the project, and of course, thank you so much to the Portman, to Samar, to Huda, who's not here with us today, to Fatima, to Becky, and everyone else who took part and came to our sessions, which we were just discussing now as slightly ridiculous and a little bit comical in some ways. And I'll explain why shortly, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how this book came about, because I think it's really important to sort of understand that it was a process. I didn't just sit down and come up with the narrative that you see in the book, but the people sat in that central table are actually mostly in the book itself. They're illustrated into the book, and theater, and especially theater of the oppressed, sort of technique developed in Brazil in the 1970s was central to letting this narrative sort of emerge. So before I dive into that, I'm going to pull the mic up and put this bottle down. Okay. Oh, thank you. I'm getting all help. Nice. That's good. Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. I never thought it'd be this tall. So before we dive into that, I wanted to give you sort of an anecdote to give you an idea about what we meant when we asked the question, who cares? So one of the first texts that I read and that I was really interested in and that got me interested in the idea of care was a text called The Ethics of Care, Debility and Dependency by Eva Feder-Kittay, who's an American theorist. And in the book, Feder-Kittay describes a scene with a teacher in a high school talking to her students. And it's a group of girls. And she writes, the teacher called Carol Gilligan writes on the board 2 words. She writes dependency and independence and asks the girls which word they like best. And as you can probably imagine, they're all extremely enthusiastic about independence. They really want to be independent. They think independence is the best. They, they're really... but what Gillian does next, and what is striking to the girls, is she rubs the word independence off the board and writes below the word dependence the word isolation. So now on the board, instead of having dependence and independence, the girls have dependence and isolation. And then she asks them again, which word do you prefer? And the girls at this point are a bit taken aback because effectively what Gillian is trying to say, what their teacher is trying to tell them, is that independence, which is sort of the mantra, what we're told is a good thing, what we're told is what we have to do. We have to be independent. We have to be on our own. We have to be able to support ourselves, is actually also, isolation is also symptomatic of independence. And this society, in some ways, or capitalist societies, tend to really value independence. And that kind of ethos, that kind of this kind of nature, tends to really offer us a very poor kind of set of capacities for dealing relationally with other people. So that's the sort of small anecdote I wanted to share with you. But the real thing I wanted to share with you is a little taste of the sort of things that we did together at Portman. So one of the things we did together is an exercise that is called a care diagram. And I was hoping maybe somebody could hand out some paper and pens for me. Oh, they're there. Oh, never mind. Okay, I've so flunked this. They're on the table. You have papers and pens. Okay, and if you'd like to participate, it's a really nice way to get us thinking together about what care means for you. And if you would like to participate, what I'd like to ask you to do is to take that piece of paper and write your name, or whatever symbolizes you, in the center. Right in the center of the piece of paper. Okay, once you've done that, I'd like you to just close your eyes for a second and think about the people or the things that you depend on. What do you depend on, or who do you depend on a day-to-day basis? It could be your hairdresser, your friends, your plants, I don't know, a pet, anything that you depend on. And you should essentially start to draw concentric circles around that me that's in the center, and then put those names of those people or of those things in those circles, and whatever is closest to you should be drawn in the first circle that is sort of like just lying outside of the center. Paper, wind. In the circle just after that, after the first circle that's closest to you, you should put who or what you depend on. It's like a little bit further out. And in the circles that are even further away from you, you should put in whatever you depend on that is maybe a larger kind of system in some ways. So you could add, I don't know, air or water. What is it that you depend on? So hopefully this should give you a sense of what sustains you. Also, sorry if my explanation isn't great. I'm extremely jet lagged. Just like, I'm like, whoa. My train of thought is flying around. Okay, so once you've done that, once you have this first sort of set of concentric circles, I'd like you to now turn the page around. So just start over on the back of your sheet and put yourself in the center once more. Pretty much, you can probably see yourself faintly from the other side. Okay. And now, try to close your eyes once more and think about what or who depends on you. It could be parents, it could be... And think about the different ways, right? It could be like financial dependency, it could be affective dependency, emotional dependency. And now, once you open your eyes, you should draw these concentric circles around that initial dot. That's you. The closer the circle, the more intense the dependency relationship to you. And the further out, as the circles become wider, sort of like a pulsating organism. As the circles become wider, you'll be able to place in things that depend on you or people that depend on you who are a little further outside. And it doesn't have to be like an intimate relationship necessarily or someone who you necessarily know. Think about the ways that the world kind of depends on you being around in some ways, if you think that's the case. Your taxpayers. Your hairdresser. The Amazon, whatever you think depends on your voice or on your presence, even slightly, or you doing something. Okay, so hopefully if this has worked somewhat, you should have two diagrams, one on one side and one on the other. And how many people have overlapping things or persons in both diagrams? A lot. How many people have the exact same things and people on both diagrams? Ooh, interesting. What you would often find, but we have an exception, is that care isn't exactly mutual, right? Care isn't a sort of system whereby you give something, you get something back from the same place or the same person, which means essentially that this diagram isn't very good for displaying care because care is a network. Care is an interlocked system of sustenance. What you give to something might come back at you vicariously in another way. But it is true, I think no one's left anything, the diagram's blank, that care exists, that systems of sustenance are there and that they support you and that dependency exists. So why do we live in a world that demonizes dependency so much when we all need it to be, well, healthy emotionally and physically, etc.? Okay, so that was my first sort of little thing. Moving on to the next thing. Before I hand over to Jana, who is going to... Joe and Alex, sorry. There we go. This is my jet lag. talking again, who are going to discuss the Portman in a little bit more detail. I'm just going to talk to you briefly about more exercises that we did. So this was one of the many exercises that we did over a period of roughly 2 years of meetings, meetings with long interruptions in the middle. Very long sometimes, but with a lot of intensity. So where I would go to the Portman and I would ask the staff to join me in working on sort of thinking through how funding cuts to care have affected the Portman Early Childhood Centre, which is partially publicly, no, I think 100% publicly funded. Yeah, 100% publicly funded, and what it has meant for the center to survive through that, and what it has meant for the care that is offered at the center. So what we would do is meet in the mornings and discuss, and also use theater, which I've mentioned a little while before, as a way to get at what care means for people involved in it on a day-to-day basis, it's sort of as a job. And so one thing that you will see in the book is essentially the sort of narratives that we were able to develop essentially through theater exercises. So we would start off with an idea and then develop that idea through theater, come up with a narrative. And the theater of the oppressed is extremely interesting in that sense because it creates a narrative that can lead to change. So different actors can come in and change the outcome of the narrative itself. So one thing that I think was really crucial is in that using that kind of theater, we were able to change constantly what the end of the storyline would be. So one thing that came up and that was very important for us was that the funding cuts had led to the children not being able to be taken out on trips. So there's a little story in there about them not being able to go to Brighton, for example, which is something they used to do, not being able to go to the library. So all of these things have an effect on the care that is offered at these centers and what is offered in terms of education and in terms of sort of livelihood in some ways to these children. So that's essentially what you will find in the book. So it's not a book that's been written in a sort of classical sense. It's not just been me coming up with a storyline, but it has been an intense process of talking, discussing, and playing out effectively different scenarios based on true stories at Portman and based on people who work there and live there. Sorry, not live there, but work there and live in their vicinity. So I'm going to hand over to Alex and Joe, and I will see you in a little bit.
You're going to sit? Am I going to sit? Yeah. There you are.
Right. 1, 2. Is this, yeah? Is this working? Yes, it's working.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for that, Adelita. We thought it would be really important at this point just to give a little bit of time for to hear more about the Portman and what you do there. So could you kind of describe the services that the Portman offers?
I can. I think the first thing I should say is the community it serves. It's one of the poorest wards in London, sitting in Westminster. If you tell people you work in Westminster, they assume you're working at the Houses of Parliament or some very, very big hotel. There are other places in Westminster that are not nearly as rich and famous. However, the people who live in Church Street are a wonderful community who need support. They live in poverty, their housing is very poor, their life expectancies are less than they would be if you live in Lancaster Gate. This is the reality of living in London. It's not a homogenous place, and I'm very glad it's not. So that's the community we serve. Care and education is not a single person's job. It is about what the old adage was, that it takes a village to raise a child. It does take a community. And I think schools and care centres need to be very mindful of the community they serve. And they must listen to the community as to what they need, not what we think they need. So at Portman, we are based around a nursery school, which is why I'm a head teacher. But around it is also a children's centre. You'll know that the glorious days of Sure Start, long gone, sadly. But we have a little bit left of that. But we also work with social workers, we work with domestic violence experts, we work with health visitors, we work with midwives, we work with anybody who'll come and work with us. Because actually, families do not just need education, and they don't just need childcare, they need much, much more. And if you're going to provide an environment where children will flourish, where the outcomes will be good, you must look at the whole family. You can't simply teach them ABC, although that's important, in order for the child to really flourish and become a really confident learner. That family has to feel part of what is happening to the child. So I work with a wonderful, wonderful group of people who spend a lot of time thinking, a lot of time talking, and some listening. And we are joyous in what we do. We have a high percentage of children who have special educational needs, and they are very important to us. We have a lot of children in need, so that some of them have social workers, they have family plans, but they are a wonderful, wonderful group of people. They all have problems, but actually I've got one or two, and most of us do. And it's about opening and saying, welcome, come and be part of our community, contribute to it, and we'll contribute to you as well.
Thanks, Jo. I'm interested in, I know Adelita referred to it earlier in the book, it's a key element of the book, but how you've experienced austerity and the cuts. How has that affected things at the Portman?
Well, what's interesting is that I was looking back over the paperwork, and I wrote my first letter to the council demanding more money in 2004. So this is not a new experience. And it's not just a Westminster experience either, currently. It's a national problem of underfunding, particularly for children with additional needs, who are more expensive to support, but are very, very important, for no less for that. The austerity really is about staffing. We don't spend, actually, very much money on anything else but staffing. So whenever there's a cut, that's what gets cut. And if you don't have the staff, you can't take children on outings, you can't take children to the park, because you haven't got the ratios. And with some of the children we have, they have high levels of need a lot of attention, a lot of adult support. That's where it's cut. The professionalism of the staff is the same, all those things, but actually the number of staff available is less.
Maybe that's a good moment to invite Jana and whoever else from the Portman wants to come up, because I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Stay on, Jo.
Stay on, Jo?
Yeah. Come in. You've been nominated.
At some point, because I have time I'm going to read.
Do you think maybe she read a little bit?
Do you want me to read a bit? Or do, oops. Oh. Okay. Oh, thanks, Jo. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. I think this is an amazing book. I encourage everyone here to make sure you leave with 1 or 5 copies. It's fantastic and beautiful, and it's a project that's near and dear to my heart. I used to work at the Serpentine, and when I was 9 months pregnant, we were writing the grant application for this series of projects with the Portman, and it was I was on the edge of realizing what a crisis childcare in this country has become, an unspoken crisis. And when I was asked to write this text, I was really honored because the project is so beautiful and so committed. But I also felt in me a kind of an outlet for a growing rage I was experiencing about the situation of care in the UK. So I wrote this text with some sort of love and rage in my heart, and I'm going to read a little bit of it to you right now. Please cut me off if I go on for too long. Okay. Currently in the UK, dependency is a dirty word. On all fronts, in the face of those seeking social assistance, those needing to be housed, those needing support to survive the uneven effects of a hot and more turbulent planet, the refrains we hear are to get off the dole, get back to work, become individually resilient, be independent. While for some independence may indeed be a goal and a possibility, at its heart this mantra shames dependency. Like a song that you cannot forget, it pushes an idea that governments need to take hold to justify their systematic stripping of common and public assets. The politics and policies of austerity, and now Brexit, that force us to be painfully and often detrimentally independent, whether we like it or not. If there is a call for community, for interdependence, it is usually made from the most precarious, the most under-resourced, the ones with the least time and the least capacity to pick up the slack that has been left behind. Who Cares is a book for children and their carers, but it is more than that. At its heart, Who Cares questions the story that values independence over dependency and the inequalities and corruption that keep this narrative intact. It is a book that recognizes that independence is not how most of the world actually works. It is not how we are born. It's not how we grow up. It is not how we learn. It's not how we eat. It's not how we love, nor what, in the course of our life, we spend most of our necessary hours doing. What that is, being dependent, being interdependent, and working to enable care for ourselves with others. Who Cares asks, like the text by Eva Feder-Kate that inspired it, if independence is the dominant story of value in our time, how do we write new stories and accompanying realities that position dependency and care as abundant, at the center, even as the systems that support caring are dismantled all around us? I just want to read a couple little bits that are to do with what's in the book, because this is sort of what the book is about in general. But in the introduction, in this little text I wrote, I just sort of described a few moments that I thought were really pertinent in the book, and this is also to entice you to read it yourselves. I'm not going to give away the ending, which is really fantastic. The protagonists of Who Cares, Dina and Mo, are children at the Portman Centre. They ask a series of simple questions like, can we go to the library today? To which their carers, Hoda and Becky, must repeat a mournful no. What follows is the children's vigilant investigation of where these possibilities and the coins that enable them have gone. Their investigation brings them into encounters with a rather slippery mayor slug, who nervously obfuscates to an amorphous black hole. The black hole, more transparent than most, reveals it has not seen or had any business with the coins. With the various twists and turns of their investigation, the children realize that coins or no coins, at the heart of the impossibilities they experience, is a deep undervaluing of what they are and what they have, a community of care. Slug and black hole aside, the questions of Dina and Mo are echoed in care centers across this country. Why are there no trips? Why are care hours cut? Why do families go into debt to pay for care? Why are those who literally produce the lives of our future paid so little, if at all? Yeah. So, da, da, da. No, you don't have to clap. It's okay. So that's like, and that's sort of like what we want to bring into this conversation, I think, which is amongst people at the Portman, Adelita and Alex, to do with the book, but also maybe people in the audience who have ideas or questions or experiences that they want to share about the challenges that they've sort of faced within certain dimensions and kinds of care in their own lives. the book, I won't tell you how it ends, but it does end on a positive note, and there's a number of proposals that are put forward for how we can sort of change this situation, from going on protests to really fundamentally overturning the way that care is organized in society. Why is it not valued? Why is it not at the center of the economies and sort of practices? Why is it to the side? Why is it undervalued? These kinds of questions come up a lot in the book. And my first question was to do with just this kind of deep undervaluing of care that's happening in our society right now, and the cuts, and then the more cuts, and the more cuts, and the more cuts that have taken place in the care sector. And we heard a little bit about that when you guys were talking before, but I was just thinking about a question about what are the implications of these cuts? What do they mean in a day-to-day reality? No more trips, but what other kinds of things have we experienced? And when I wrote in the text about the debt of parents, I was writing my own personal story, of going into debt to pay my child's private childcare because there was no public care available. And so, many people in this country have the same experience of actually being indebted to banks because they couldn't afford their own childcare. And that's like a fundamental kind of issue. So what are the implications, but maybe more than that, what have we done to resist them? Because I know that the Portman Centre, for example, hasn't been idly sort of accepting the cuts and has actually taken kind of proactive stance in relation to it. So should we talk about maybe other people, maybe what their experiences are, but also how they've responded to this situation that we're in? Does anyone...
I think the problem is inequality, that actually we live in a community and a place that is increasingly unequal, and that the prospects for children depend on where you're born, who your parents are, how much money they've got, and I think in 2019 that's not a great place to be.
Do you want to tell us, I don't know if, Becky, you want to say something about the day you stormed Parliament? Do you want to say anything about that?
It was a town hall. It was a town hall. It was Marylebone Town Hall. At the time, I was a parent using... I am still a parent, but I used to be a parent at Portman with my twins, and now I work at Portman, which has been great for me. They've gone to school. They're 10 now, and I'm still at Portman, so it's like home from home. And I think my girls were about 2. I had the twin pram. We rocked up at Portman. They'd made placards, and we all marched our way to Marylebone Town Hall to argue that they needed to give us more money and they couldn't cut the services. And like I say, my twins were 2. We lived in a 2-bedroom temporary accommodation. So for me to take my eldest to school and then to use Portman as my second place, I would feed my girls there. We'd hang out all day. We'd do the trips because we still had them then. And then I'd pick up my eldest and then we'd go home. And that was pretty much Monday to Friday for me. It just became part of my routine. But now in drop-in, they don't do trips. They don't have lunch club because they don't have the staff. They don't even have drop-in every day because they don't have the staff to support it. So if I had my twins now, I wouldn't have anywhere to go on a day-to-day basis. So, and I think this is where, new mums really, really struggle because they need somewhere to go and all these places are just disappearing. And that's going to impact hugely on their mental health, on their children's well-being.
Yeah, I don't have children myself, but I was very sort of touched, and I found it really important to be doing this book with people who have children and who've experienced very intimately what it means to go through the current kind of situation, and who have experienced sort of life at both ends of the cuts. And I think something I actually forgot in the introduction, which I thought was important too, is the notion of care is also about acknowledging in some ways, which is one of the reasons why this book exists, and which I find one of the strategies in some ways to counteract the sort of sense of isolation that accompanies kind of funding cuts and cuts to services, is the idea that acknowledging that we're all only temporarily abled and that we've come from places of dependence on others. We've all been small. Some of us will grow to be very old and need spaces like these, and people like Becky and Joe who work in environments that facilitate care. In their case, for young future citizens, and in other cases for people who are much older. And if you've ever experienced any kind of dependency on others, which we all have as children, but even in your adult life with disability or anything like that, sort of physical dependence, then you understand how much these sort of spaces are important. And so that's just what I wanted to say.
And I think also one of the things that I was sort of reminded of when I was reading about the struggles of these fictional characters, who are going and asking the Mayor Slug where'd the coins go, where are they, trying to trace where the resources are for care, where are they, where did they go, why are they not here? And but I was also thinking about the new movements now in the world that are really bringing the attention to these kinds of issues, like the kind of millions of women who have been going on strike in Latin America in the Ni Una Menos, Not One Less campaigns, which are, really profoundly talking about what is it for care labor, but in particular sort of acknowledging that care labor is unequally distributed amongst women, those are the still in this world. Women are the ones who take on, women of color in particular, are the ones who take on the major burden of care in societies. So those movements, and, there's a lot of new unions of cleaners and care workers and people who are starting to try and bring this kind of to the fore and make these kinds of demands that aren't just for more money from the state, but also a total overturn in the kind of value system that underpins the way we distribute resources. So for me, that's what the book sort of brought up. The second question was to do with the process, because you talked a little bit, Adelita, about how you subjected workers at the Portman Centre to theatre exercises and various other kinds of experiments. And I was just thinking about, when I was doing a bit of research to write the text for the book, I was looking at these 20th century early socialist children's stories that were written to tell the story about, what would life be like if we didn't live under capitalism, basically. But they were always written kind of from above, it was like an author's ideology or their idea of what should happen in the future. But this came from workers, it came from children, it came from parents in the Portman Centre. And I guess the question is to do with those techniques of things like drawing care maps, doing theater enactments, or theater of the oppressed work. Was that useful and helpful as a way to sort of get at the issues? And also, maybe for Adelita, maybe for everyone, do you see those being useful in other kinds of contexts as well, and what kinds of contexts?
Okay, so I hated the theatre. And I'm not keen being here right now, but yeah, so Adelita would come in and we'd start our little groups, and then she'd say, you've got to reenact something. Was it really bad happening?
Well, it was mostly
there was lots of things.
Telling us,
yeah.
Telling me, and then I was like,
and it was good to act it out because it makes it become real again. And there was quite a few mums, parents from Portman, who joined in as well. So it was fun. We got used to it. Yeah. We got used to your little things, your quirky little things that we had to do, and it did week on week. It's created what we now have as the book, which is great, and the stories that came from that. If we hadn't have done the little drama things, we probably wouldn't have got all the stories. You wouldn't have understood all what we were trying to say. So it was a big part of it. Just wasn't my favourite.
Yeah, I know. We picked you as an ambassador for this moment. Just get a bit of negative feedback. It's obviously a complex task to be thrown into an environment where I didn't know people at the Portman didn't know who I was, and to be thrown into a really intimate setting where we're doing physical work, essentially. We're doing drama. We're reenacting parts of narratives that come out of conversation. So I think one thing is to just have a conversation, for you guys to tell me what's going on. It was something completely different, much more intimate, much more comical in ways. To reenact situations that were being sort of discussed at Portman, and to find different endings, which is one of the reasons why the Theatre of the Oppressed, particularly as a methodology, was so important and interesting, because it allows you essentially, as a method, to find a different ending to the story. And we discussed the ending in various ways, and trying to come up with like an ending that would work, and sort of compromise on. I'm not going to say what the ending is, but on after the sort of protest moment, which really comes out of what Becky illustrated earlier, of you guys going to Westminster and like actually protesting, something sort of fantastical happens. And it's also a little bit unresolved, which is kind of where we were in some ways at this moment of a resolution. And it asks, I think, and this is why the form of the children's book is so important, for children and parents to talk about it. So one of the reasons why it was important for me to make a book that had a sort of, kind of unresolved ending in some ways, was to allow for children and parents to gather around a book, and as the parents are reading it to the children, to think through what the endings can be, collectively and individually. So that was... If anyone has any more questions on the methodology, I'm happy to answer them.
In the last question, before we open it up, because we have some questions for the audience also, but one last question was just to do with the book itself. So we have this like really beautiful object with these amazing images, illustrations, and a really poignant story. So I guess the question is, in this sort of moment where so many things are circulating by other means, where kids are watching their screens quite a lot, how do you guys imagine this book being used? Obviously I have ideas. I'm going to read it at bedtime, and I think what I might do is take it to my kids' school and sort of see if we can do like a collective reading of it in the classroom. But I'm wondering if the Portman Centre has ideas for how you might use this, but also Adelita and the Serpentine, of how you want it to circulate, and what would you like people to do as it's being read? Yeah.
Donate money.
That's a point.
A significant proportion of the profits from this book are going to Portman, so please donate money. That's important. I think initially we had discussed sort of shipping it to many childhood centres across the UK, and making it available essentially as a story. And I think one thing that is very much part of my practice is to think about the materiality, or how things are sort of objects, and to be able to touch them and feel them. And drama in some ways is to do with the body, understanding that you have a body, coming into your body, feeling your body. So having it as an object where you're actually turning the pages in the presence of children and the presence of others is really important as a sort of object of communion of some kind.
So we're nearing 2, and so we thought at this point it would be great just to open up and see, first of all, if people have questions for anybody on the panel about the process and the project, but also if people have experiences that they want to share about the effects of austerity, funding cuts, and these kinds of changes in relation to your own lives and experiences of care, the webs of care that you exist within. Does anyone have anything they want to ask or say? Just thank you. Okay. You're welcome.
My parking expires.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no
Put
problem.
my name down.
Okay. No?
I have a question for the headmistress. I kind of want to ask about how it was to welcome Adelita, like an artist, into your school and care center, and how that experience was for you and you.
it was wonderful. It's always been wonderful to welcome people from the Serpentine, because what they do is create discourse and challenge, and that's healthy. As soon as I heard drama, I handed her over to Becky.
Just like artists being in the Portman.
Yeah, we love the artists. We love Serpentine at Portman. We've done so many projects. I did the one with Adelita. I've also done the giving the kids cameras and going around Church Street, which is great fun. They just take pictures of everything, don't they? Tyres, shoes, dog poods, whatever they want to take. So I really look forward to seeing the outcome of that. We've done a shape one. We've done loads, and they just are amazing. They're just so great for the kids. The kids love it, and so do we.
I think one of the other things about having the Serpentine in particular is that it validates the staff. They don't get much remuneration, but I think the fact that we're involved in something quite special, and that the staff are recognised for the quality and extent of what they do, and their thoughtfulness and their passion is recognised. I think that's really important. Sometimes, although we do the job, we love the job, it doesn't do any harm to be recognised.
Does anyone else have anything they want to say or ask? Or yeah. Oh.
I'm curious about your thoughts around, why is care kind of neglected in the sense of being funded and supported financially, and there's a tendency for carers to be female. And I've always wondered about that, and I just wondered what your views are in relation to that, why possibly there may be the fact that it doesn't make money directly, so it can't be it can't be it's not got a standard to it. It's long-term kind of gains rather than short-term, and then also how it's not valued as it's something given tends to be given by women. Yeah.
I mean, many years ago, the two words education and care were indivisible. You couldn't have education without care, and care included education. As soon as it became separate, I think we had a problem, because the words we use matter, how we use words matter. So care became an industry, really. And that the drive to get women back to work, which is laudable, because poverty is also not something we want people to experience. But there was a very unhealthy view that getting women back to work was the answer, without really thinking about what the repercussions or the problems that might develop meant, because historically childcare has been women's role, except of course in times of war, when women were wanted to go back into the industries, and at that time that's when all the daycare centres were developed during that wartime period, because there was a need. They needed the women, and therefore they had to provide the care. Really, as soon as that was over and women were no longer needed within the workforce quite to that extent, those fell away, and then care became much more of an independent business type project. And I think that's where it began to. But without doubt, this is a feminist issue. You can't get away from that, really. But for me, caring has to be at the heart of education. and we've lost that a little bit. I think that the density of the curriculum, particularly the primary curriculum now, means that care for teachers is much more difficult because the expectations, the testing, all of which, if they provide better outcomes for children, meaning that they have better opportunities, is all good. But I think somewhere along the line, the balance is a little bit out of sync from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree. It's a feminist issue. And also just I always go back to like what happened in the 70s kind of women's movement, because I try and think about, okay, well, how did we kind of get here, And just the way that, some women within the feminist movement, we often think that what women were arguing for was equality, so that women could go to work just like men could and get the same wage as men could. But actually, a large number of feminists were actually arguing for a complete undoing of the economy, such that care work would be valued as work, not as something that you undervalue and pay somebody else to do, but that actually like something like, say, the 3-day work week, where 5 days a week we actually spend time compensated to do care work communally, in communities, that those were the kinds of things that were being advocated for by a large portion of the feminist movement, that then got kind of switched into this idea that actually what we want is just like an equal wage and the right to be exploited as workers like men are, which doesn't totally make sense. So, this kind of idea, when you put profit at the center and you try and resolve issues of inequality through profit-making entities, it just doesn't work, because care is, as you said, it's as an economy, care is endless. If we put it at the center, we could not live in capitalism. We just couldn't, because it's if we tried to put a value on it, like it would just sink the ship. Do you know what I mean? Like it's too much money, but it's absolutely crucial. And the only way under capitalism we've figured out a way to deal with that is to completely undercut it and undervalue it. And of course, the kind of historical sexism is sort of built right into that equation. And capitalism was always built on the erasure of women's labor. I mean, it's fun. One of its fundamental gestures is to erase women's labor, and care labor. So it's kind of hard. The two are so entangled in each other. It just can't resolve itself through profit-making entities. It just won't. So. Yeah, but I agree. Feminist issue. Yeah, but not a feminist issue that doesn't implicate men profoundly, because, it's a feminist issue that is shared by our society. And I think that's one of the big things of the book. What it argues in the end is care is something that it's not to do with parents taking care of their kids or care workers. It's about the society valuing the care, that caring for children, for the elderly, for people who, that's a social project. That's not an individual, a family. Yeah, exactly. And it's a joyful project too. When it isn't independent and a burden, it's joyful work. So, yeah. Okay, on that, should we end now? We can have informal chats. Please come on up or mingle around and chat with each other if you like. But I think we should just maybe end by thanking so much the care work of the Portman Centre for the amazing work that they do. Also of Alex and Adelita. And maybe we can... Yeah, the parents, Salma and Fatima. And also I thought we could maybe just pretend for a moment that this pavilion we're in is a monument to the unrecognized care workers all over the world. So we can just recontextualize where we're sitting and pretend that's what it is, and sort of try and produce a sense of recognition. So why don't we do a round of applause for all of these people and the care workers.